Hello, this is Mike Hayes with the Hiring Confessional. Today I'm going to start something new in this program because we had another podcast I was a part of last week that had a really interesting comment about going to work at 7 o'clock. And it garnered over 500,000 views and some real vitriol back and forth between people of, I don't know where they are, grandma's basement or whatever, but I was just fascinated by how people took what the guy said and took it into another dimension. For example, here's one of the first ones. Never work for a bald, dumb goatee guy. Because there was two of us with a goatee and two of us were bald, so it was pretty easy to figure out who those people were. Pay people more. Minimum wage should be $66 an hour. Wow, that's awesome. 7 a.m. work schedule is horrible. And then we had somebody that had a little limerick that I liked, and I'll have to sing it because it sounds better. Boss makes $5, I make a dime. That's why I poop on company time. That was their exact quote. And then nobody dies if I don't show up at 7 a.m. So today, for my confessional part, usually I like to do a confessional on something in hiring, but because of what I experienced this morning driving here, I'm going to do it to you Prius owners. Get off the street. You are going slower than a lawnmower, and every time I run into one, I got to go to an appointment. I don't know if they have a gas pedal on there or what, but please sell it and get a regular car or ride a bike. Today's guest, as we transition, is Russ Law with Verensics. Now, Russ, this is a one-liner that my ChatGPT come up with. Now, I address her as Judy because I needed to have a name for her, so she responds to Judy and calls herself Judy. Her one-liner about your company, and you can tell us how accurate this is, Verensic helps companies spot bad hires before they become expensive problems. Russ, what did you think of that?
First of all, it's great that you went ahead and personified your ChatGPT. I haven't gotten to that spot yet, so I'm still, moving toward that. But I appreciate Judy's attention to detail. She's correct. That's what we do, but it actually goes a little bit further than that. So I'll go ahead and take the mic and tell you a little bit about what it is we do and who we are. So, first of all, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to chat with you this morning on Recruiting Confessional. I'm coming to you from the Verensics offices in Atlanta, Georgia. And my name is Russ Law, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Verensics. So we are a software as a service platform engineered to evaluate the entire life cycle of personnel risk. And that's why I said partially correct. So we do that using rule-based AI-powered questionnaires. So essentially what we do is we gather data directly from candidates and employees using these AI-powered questionnaires, and we turn that data into human intel that you can use to make better decisions about who to hire and to drive more successful employee investigations outcomes. So we essentially put an industrial psychologist in a box so that any organization, no matter how big, small, sophisticated, or just getting started, can have that in their toolbox. And it levels the playing field for understanding the integrity and trustworthiness of your candidates and your employees. So let me ask you, Mike, have you ever hired someone who passed all the standard background checks, but later showed integrity or conduct issues after you hired them?
Oh, yeah, like every week.
Okay, so that's okay. It's not you, it's the process. So we rely very heavily on background checks, tip lines, reference checks, but those only capture a fraction of the data. And what they do capture is quite often incomplete and sometimes inaccurate. So what our platform does, what our questionnaires do, is monitor and analyze disclosures, time consumption, consistency, cursor tracking, so that it can ask intelligent and logical follow-up questions and present persuasive feedback to the person taking the questionnaire. And the resulting intelligence that you get is in the form of admissions, observations, attitudes, And it gives our customers the ability to make human capital decisions based on data and not a hunch, and to build cultures of trust, transparency, and accountability, because that's really what it's all about.
That's pretty interesting because, and then I want to get into some of the uses and what type of employees. I mean, I've never, my confession is I've never been a big test guy. One of the things I did when I first bought my staffing company is I put applications in the app room that said, don't fill this application out in pencil. But then I put only pencils in there. So the entire day, not one person came out and asked for a pen. And I was like, okay, that's a pretty cheap test, but that just goes to show you, that just goes to show you that, I mean, people don't read, they don't pay attention, all these other things. So where are the best applications for your tool as far as what levels of people and things like that? How does that work?
Well, I know I'm going to sound a bit cliche here, but it's really applicable at all levels, because we're not we're not a test in terms of, or an assessment in terms of, is this person going to be, good at sales, or is this person going to be good as a developer? Our positioning is that one of the mistakes that companies make is treating personnel risk as something that starts after the hire. And what our data shows is that most of those signals are already present in the applicant pool if you ask the right behavioral questions. So the whole purpose is to bring the conversation of behaviors and attitudes about integrity and trustworthiness to the forefront, so that you can have good conversations about those kinds of topics that most of the time are completely left out of the pre-hire conversation, for whatever reason, because the interviewer might not be that adept at asking those kinds of questions. They might feel a bit squeamish about those kinds of questions. They might feel like it's rude for some reason to ask if someone is planning on stealing from you if you hire them. I've heard an awful lot of excuses.
What does so I did a lot of background checks, and you're right. When you got to go through the city stuff and the county and all that, I mean, it's horrible. Drug tests are now a freaking joke. I know people that can go to a head shop and buy pee and stuff, so that's not even reliable anymore. And with all the pot legalization, what do you test for? So in your instance, is your program or the situation that you've put together, is that like, here's a box for the employer and then they operate it, or do you somehow monitor that and help with that, or how is it all set up in advance through like a website or app, or how does that go? How do you go about doing that?
So it's all completely automated through our online app. So you can have a candidate or an employee complete one of our questionnaires on any internet-enabled device. It is very fast. It only takes about 10 minutes for someone to complete one of our questionnaires. The questions are timed, and when the person taking the questionnaire is done, you have the results immediately. And the point of the survey is to gather information about what are they involved in, what do they have forgiving attitudes about, and what would they be willing to report if they saw it happening in your organization, and apply that to the conversation that you're going to have with them about fitting into your culture. Because it's not just about cultural fit, really. It's about cultural protection. Anybody who runs a company should understand that it takes a lot to develop a culture, but it doesn't take much for it to fall apart. And so if you are not asking these behavioral questions and making sure that someone is going to toe the line in what you want as your company culture, then you're just rolling the dice.
Now, I would imagine that, is this like drug screens and background checks? So I meet, Mrs. X or Mrs. Y for a job. Do you implement this after you make obviously make an offer predicated on the test, drug screen, and background check. Is that where you use it, or do you use it in advance before you even talk to anybody? Which I don't think that's probably the way, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Actually, that is the way. And that's the cool thing about our platform is from a legal perspective, it's considered an interview as opposed to a background check. So we're not going out and gathering any information from open source or anything like that. So you don't have to have any kind of conditional offer that's been given beforehand. Most of our clients who use this on the pre-employment side of the fence, they use it very early in their process, way before they would make a conditional offer. And the whole purpose there is that it tells them, do I even want to interview this person? If this person is admitting to being involved in stealing or being involved in sexual harassment or workplace violence, do I even need to look at this person further? Because this information is coming directly from the person. We're asking very direct questions about what they've done, what their attitudes are, and what they'd be willing to report. And if you have that as ammunition whenever you're doing a follow-up interview, you can ask questions that would normally feel very odd and would normally feel very kind of stilted. One example might be, a question that we have is, would you cover up for a good friend who is using drugs at work? Now, if the person says, yes, I would cover up for a good friend who is using drugs at work, how would you work that into a conversation if you didn't have our survey as backup? That would be pretty awkward, I think. Do you agree?
Yes. Yeah.
So the neat thing, the neat kind of psychological process that people go through when they answer these questions is when they admit something, they now have a stake in the ground. And so whenever you go back and you ask them, hey, on your survey, you said that you may cover up for a friend who was using drugs at work. Can you tell me more about that? It doesn't need to be confrontational. It just needs to be worded in a way that's going to discover more context. That's what we're after. It's not about a gotcha. It's about understanding the context behind people's behaviors and are they going to be the right fit? They might have an answer to that question where they say, one of my good friends, they were addicted and, I was trying to get them help. And now you found out more about who they are and who their true character is.
So it's not necessarily going to be 100% disqualifying if you get an answer kind of like that.
Absolutely not. Okay. And I always, so we're a little bit different than most software companies. Most software companies, it's just something that you can do on the software, if it's customer relationship management or something like that, there's not a whole lot of human interface. What we're doing is we're gathering human intel. And so it's used as a tool to have a better conversation and get to know somebody better. So you're not kind of just sitting down and having the same old questions. Like if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? That's silly. And it doesn't tell me, are you going to be somebody who's trustworthy and who I should invite into my culture and who's going to do good things here. And that's really the crux of what we're after. It's not to, push somebody out of contention. It's to help our clients understand who these people are and should they even be part of the organization because they represent so much risk. And that's really where, I think talent acquisition and recruiting kind of fails right now. I'm going to be a little bit bold and say it fails. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who would argue that I'm wrong, but these types of behavioral interviews are very rare from my experience in the hiring process, and they shouldn't be. Behavioral interviews are one of those things that should be ubiquitous in the hiring process.
Now, I could see this, especially because when I advise clients, the bigger companies, they're into this marathon interviewing, like 5 people. I got to talk to the janitor, the receptionist, the owner, the whoever, the owner's kids, and it just wears people out. So would this eliminate going through that hassle and not having to involve a bunch of other people that probably, by the way, hate interviewing other people?
I don't think it would eliminate it. I think it would make it much more efficient because I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, I have tons of friends who have gone through that kind of interview process, and it's so draining, not only for the candidate, but for the people doing the interviews because they feel like they need more, but they're not sure how to get more. And I firmly believe that part of the reason for that is because the hiring is not just about who can do the job, it's about who you're giving access, trust, and influence to. And if you're not asking the right questions to understand, should I trust this person? Should I have them be part of my culture? Should I give them access to all of these very valuable things that I've built up in my business over the years? You're going to feel like there's something missing and you just need one more meeting to maybe figure it out. But if you're not doing a behavioral conversation to figure out if you can trust them, then you're still going to be left, even at the hiring date, with, well, yeah, they can do the job, but we don't really know anything about who they are besides they want to be an oak tree.
Now, do you? I don't know if you can reveal this or not, but what's one of the questions you have that stumps a lot of people? I'm sure there's a number of questions that you use, but what's the one that always catches somebody if they can get through the most of the thing without flubbing up? Is there a particular question that catches a lot of people?
I haven't thought of it in that way. Probably because there's not. The way that our questions are written, then they're all written by industrial psychologists and seasoned investigators. And all the questions are yes, no, agree, disagree. And so they're very much focused on a particular data point. So most people are going to get about 100 or so questions throughout the questionnaire. But one thing that I don't think I really mentioned is that no two of our questionnaires are alike. Every single one is unique because they're all based on performance. And the categories that we have chosen were based on a lot of evidence-based research into what are the biggest risks that could impact an organization, whether it's a government organization, whether it's private industry, what are those? And so we have 13 behavior categories. And within each one of those behavior categories, we ask about what people are involved in, what do they have forgiving attitudes about, how likely would they be to report something that wasn't happening. Now, one other aspect I will mention, and we might want to get into this a little bit later, is we have another kind of column to our platform, which is internal employee investigations. So we gather data not only from the pre-screening side, we're seeing data from the post-hire. And that's, I think, a big aspect of what people hiring people kind of lose focus of. If you are not screening appropriately on the front end, those people who you're giving access to are the people you're subsequently going to be investigating for doing something that they shouldn't do. I know that's a little bit off topic from the question you asked. I think my point is that there's no real one question that kind of gives people pause or kind of stumps people. And nothing, I haven't ever heard of any of our questions stumping people because they're all written at a kind of junior high reading level. And that's intentional. It's not meant to stump, it's meant to gather. One interesting aspect of the kind of post question, or the post survey follow-up that our clients do is we recommend that they go in and ask very simply, how did you feel about the survey? And just be quiet. And what you will find is that one question, like you mentioned, is different for everybody. But there will be a one question. And it might be, oh, well, I need to explain this about the way I answered that. You've now gotten context without having to do anything except for wait 10 minutes and ask a question that is very simple.
It's interesting because every test, personality test or whatever I've ever been given, I've probably failed. And I think it's because one, I'm incapable of BSing enough and I just answer the question. Like one of the ones I got stumped on, and I took one, it was an integrity test. Another vendor had it like 15 years ago. And it said, like, if somebody took like grabbed a woman's hair in line, what would you do? And my answer was, I'd punch the guy. And that's not the answer they want. They want some type of peacemaker where they come in and try to, keep everything down. But I thought that was kind of an unfair question because I think most males would probably say that. But I kind of knew that was wrong. I mean, I could have said, I'd try to talk to him or, I'd call the police, which would get there 5 weeks later. But, do you
Right.
run into that topic and stuff like that where people are confused on the type of question you're asking?
Um, so I'll speak to the integrity test piece of it. And so the integrity test is something that I would say is a bit archaic, especially compared to kind of where we are now. Um, our platform does measure integrity, it does measure trustworthiness, and we present the findings in a way that are not so much like, hey, don't hire this person because they scored poorly on workplace violence. And I have a side story about that. When we were doing, kind of beta testing for this years and years ago, my wife took it, which in hindsight, I don't know if that was a good idea or not.
Probably not.
But I asked her to take it, and I go to look at the results, and I said, "Honey, what happened on the workplace violence section?" Because she did the same thing you did, and she had a very similar response. If somebody did that to me, I wouldn't tolerate it, that kind of thing. That's fantastic. Now I have context. So the way that our platform works is you don't get a score. You basically are just presented with there's high risk in this category, and here's why. And as you are reviewing the here's why, you can see the actual questions that they answered and what their answers were. So we have elements built into the platform where you can kind of facilitate that conversation and say, okay, tell me what it was about that question that made you answer the way that you did. And you will probably tell me exactly what you just told me, Mike, that, I'm not going to allow that kind of thing to happen. This is how I imagine that scenario. And we have tools within the platform that say Mike had a reasonable response. And it tells the entire system, ignore that finding. What that also does is it creates a due diligence audit trail so that if later on down the road, Mike actually does have some problems with, threatening coworkers or anything like that, we can go back and see, oh, okay, we flagged this, but we decided, based on the information that we had at the time, to go ahead and move forward. So it allows you to have just so much more insight into how you made decisions and why you made those decisions, and then to be able to go back and say, did we do the right thing here, or do we need to pivot?
The other thing was about that integrity test, and this was years ago. I don't know if they ever changed it, but how does your stuff deal with like marijuana? Because back then, Arizona just got medical marijuana cards, and you could go buy pot or whatever you wanted to do with one of those cards. So when you ask a question as, do you buy drugs? And that's it's a yes or no answer, but most people think, or it was asking about the legality. Well, it was legal if you had the card. Now it's legal pretty much anywhere, any of the states that have the law. But federally, it's not. But Joe Six-Pack doesn't rationalize that in his head, and I get it. He's like, oh, I could go buy pot here. Why does it make a big deal if it's federally? It does if you're driving trucks and stuff like that. But how does yours deal with that?
It's a very, I would say, complex issue. And that's one that we looked at very, very closely as we were putting together the question set for illegal drugs and alcohol. So basically, substance abuse and misuse is kind of the way we fell down on that. The way that we did it ensures that it is applicable to all 50 states and federal. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but essentially it's not just one question. It's kind of a web of questions that asks about even prescription drugs, that asks about illegal drugs, that asks, kind of rationalization type questions, because the most important risk signal is often not the prior misconduct. It's the rationalization. And that's something that we see a lot from our both sides of the platform, from the pre-employment and the post-employment, the investigative piece, is that it shows up in attitudes that kind of normalize, excuse, or even minimize the misconduct. So it's not necessarily getting somebody to say, yeah, I did cocaine on the way into work this morning, because they're most likely going to understand that that's going to hurt them to admit. What they will more likely do is admit to forgiving attitudes about that kind of thing. And again, it's all about gathering context about behaviors and about beliefs and about trustworthiness. So it's not a one and done fix. It's more of kind of a web of questions that are all put together to understand the risk that somebody represents around substance abuse in that case.
Now, it's interesting because I do a lot of industrial staffing, and I always have. And it's very unique because that group of people is very brutally honest. That's why when you interview a high-end salesperson or corporate people, they have all this jibber jabber that they learned at, wherever the heck they went to school. And they know how to dodge and juke out of there. Or it's like a politician. They never tell you anything in like one sentence. It's never a yes or no. I got to explain everything first. And they'll just blurt out the answer. Hey, what's about your last boss? Oh, she was a bitch. Oh, blah, blah, blah. Oh, really? That's interesting. Let's talk about that. You don't get that from professional SARS. But I like the rawness, because at least I'm not going to get a mishy-mashy answer. Now, a lot of people that'll listen or see clips from this thing will be, oh, this is just another thing. You don't want to talk to people. You want to use a test. You want to use robots and stuff to pick people. And, oh, my God, it's the end of the world, blah, blah, blah. I mean, where do you see this fitting in there, and how do you counteract that? Some people might just say, hey, dude, I'm not taking that test. These are people that won't even fill out an application correctly. So how do you get over that?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there,
Yeah.
Mike. I'm going to try.
I tend to ramble.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
It's great. I think it's a very deep question. First of all, the AI aspect of things. I do believe that we're very much in kind of a state of flux right now, of people not quite understanding what the AI tools are capable of and how they should use them. The approach that we have taken is that we use it to automate the parts that should be automated and work hard to recognize the parts that should not. The parts that should be automated and are very kind of ripe for automation are being able to ask a lot of questions in a short amount of time and gather information in a short amount of time. But not only being able to ask a lot of questions, being able to ask the right questions. And so, I mentioned before, all of our questions are written by industrial psychologists. That's on purpose. They weren't written by AI, because we truly value the psychology aspect of how you ask questions and what the words are going to be interpreted as. So the AI piece of it is, if people answer things in a certain way, or if they are inconsistent, or if they are showing signs of taking more time on some questions than others, that is going to influence how the system decides what questions should it ask next, what kind of feedback should it present to this person to put them in the right frame of mind to divulge as much as possible. that is kind of our approach to how you use AI in a responsible way to get information that's going to let you make better decisions and also let you have better face-to-face conversations or Zoom conversations, whatever it is, real conversations with the people who you're screening to employ. So the kind of take this test and it's going to decide whether or not you get hired. I believe that there's a lot of situations that occur right now where assessments are used and no human ever reviews them. And that is a problem because these are people that you're hiring. Like if you're not going to let a human review what these assessments or tests or whatever it is you want to call them, if you're not going to let a human actually understand what those things say, if you're just well, take it and you either make it through the process or you don't, I think that's fine on the the skills type assessments, on the aptitude types assessments most of the time. But then there's also people who are not great test takers who would end up being phenomenal employees. And I've rooted these out on my own staff and people I've hired myself where, they may have shown up on our survey as, in the red, they're risky as hell, but you start having a conversation with them and you realize that there's a good reason they answered the way they did, and they actually don't represent that kind of risk. But now I've had a candid conversation with this person who I'm hiring about what my expectations are and what my concerns are with the way that they answered. So it's now provided this robot that asks all these questions has now not made a decision for me. It has provided me with significantly better data to have a better real conversation with the person that I'm hiring. So hopefully that kind of got to all the aspects of the question that you had. If
My
not, happy
complicated.
to.
This is what's interesting now. I think what you just said was the crux of the service. And so I want to make sure that I kind of ask you in Mike Hayes' dumb language that I like to use all the time. So unlike the integrity test was like thumbs up or thumbs down, and you just rely on that, this is more of a tool that instead of just using it for up or down, the manager or who the hiring person is now looking at it. And like you said, we got a human being interviewing people. And I think if you, correct me if I'm wrong, if I present it that way to an applicant, like, hey, we have this survey we want you to take. Everybody has to take it. It's not going to not get you the job. It's not going to get you the job, but we use it kind of as a way in our second interview process or blah, blah, blah. Is that kind of the way you would probably want that used in the business world?
I like that, and I haven't heard it put in those terms. Like it's not going to lose you the
I'm a
job. It's not going to get
simpleton.
you the
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
I love that. I might borrow that or just plain
Feel
steal
free.
it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a totally valid way to look at this. It is, not it's not going to make the decision as to whether or not we want to bring you on board. What it is going to do is it's going to help us understand what we need to ask next. Because the thing about interviewing people is it's not just did you ask the questions? Like, do I have, my sheet in front of me and I'm asking the questions that all the candidates get? It's knowing which questions to ask.
What do you, okay, so give me, is there various levels of this? If I don't know if you can share with, how do you price the stuff? Is it on how many tests you do? Is it per test, or how does that work generally? If you can divulge that.
Sure. Simply, I mean, we're a subscription service, so that is going to run a spectrum of people who are hiring one person a month, who can join and throw it on their company credit card, and it's very easy for them to do and very I would say low cost considering the information that we get, and that extends all the way up to enterprise where we have hundreds of users in an organization that are using thousands of surveys every month. We basically, we customize and tailor our subscription costs based on how much you're going to be using the system.
Now, how long have you guys been in business? So I think you're quite new, aren't you? Kind of you're in the startup phase still, or you've moved on from that?
I say we're a maturing startup, depending on the vernacular you would like to use there. We've been a company since 2017, but we started with this iteration of our platform in 2020. And so we've had clients who have been with us pretty much since the very beginning of 2020, and have been very happy with the turnaround that we've made in their misconduct going way down, their turnover going way down. I mean, some of the organizations that we work with, I mean, they've experienced like an 80% drop over, a 3-year period in terminations for misconduct. So it's a pretty significant impact when you hire for integrity on the front end. A lot of times you can teach people how to do the job, but you're not going to change their character.
And with everybody so sensitive at work now, you can't say anything, you can't do this, you can't do that. You really, that's important, because if you get some loose wire in there, you spend your whole day putting out fires and going to HR and listening to them. And everybody knows I'm not a huge fan of HR, but you end up putting yourself in this position of you spending your whole day doing that instead of what you're supposed to be doing.
Well, that's kind of an interesting aspect of what we do. So, I think, going back to what you said before about the organizations who just interview people, to death practically. You're going through 8 rounds of interviews and they keep asking you questions and you're like, what in the heck are they trying to find out? They're a lot of times kind of grasping at straws, because the people doing those interviews have received no interview training. Except for maybe legal said, don't ask them this, don't ask them that, don't ask them that. And so they have a group of questions they need to stay away from legal perspective, but they don't really know what they can ask. And so what we do is we have all of our questions vetted by employment counsel several times a year, for all 50 states and federally. And so we are able to ask about those behaviors and keep everything in legal bounds. And even if say, for example, depending on what organization you work for, the legal team might have a bit more of a conservative approach than others, with what they're comfortable asking. If that's the situation, we actually have the ability for you to just exclude questions from what your candidates see. So if you tell me, I don't want you to ask anything about this, or this, we can do that. And it's super simple. And that way, that standard has been met. Whereas if you are just, if you're a hiring manager and you hire people, 3 or 4 times a year, every time you hire somebody, you now have to kind of get yourself worked back up to, okay, what is it I can ask? What do I want to ask? Because it's not something that you do often.
So here's another thing. You mentioned a thing about my thing with the interviews. I teach a class at GCU in the business college. And one of the things, these poor kids are trying to get a internship. You would think they were interviewing to be a diamond cutter. Okay. They've gotten 5 interviews to get a intern. Okay. So I'm like, who the hell is gauging this that can't figure this out in maybe 1 or 1.5 interviews? So let me give you an example that maybe and you can tell me if this would be a fit or not. Instead of doing that, which by the way, 5 interviews, I've lost the candidate I probably should have hired, because they're not going to wait around to do 5 interviews.
They've probably already been hired by somebody like me.
Exactly. Or I have hired them for my business group because I'm dealing with the owner and he's like, oh, I'll do it right now.
Right.
So I would think of, if you're going against 5 interview Willie, that does every time, you could probably do 1 interview and maybe 1.5, 2 at the most if you used your product. Is that kind of where you would pitch that to be the perfect kind of balance?
Every organization is different. So I'm gonna get a bit politician on you here. So I'm gonna answer a little bit indirectly.
Okay.
Every organization is different, and so there are some organizations where that level of efficiency is just not going to work for the leadership in charge. And so that's really what it comes down to, is how involved is the true leadership in the process. Because I've had, multiple clients who have had leadership that really doesn't even understand what their process is. And part of what we do going in is have them reflect on their process. What is it you're doing? Like, when do you do this? When do you do this? When do you do this? And what actually ends up happening, which is pretty cool, is a lot of our clients will totally redo their process while they're in talks with us. A lot of times just to fit us in, but they take that opportunity because now we've kind of opened their eyes, like, we've been just doing this and we didn't really think about what it is. So a lot of times leadership is not that involved in how the process works. And what that does is it allows the bureaucracy to take over unchecked. And you end up getting, somebody who says, well, I need to interview him for this, and somebody else who says, well, I need to interview him for that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you end up with 5 interviews for an unpaid internship, which is absurd. And I think the more efficient ways that I've seen this applied is very early on the front end. You use our survey to discover these behavioral qualities, and then you use that in the first real interview to help you ask questions about scenarios, to ask questions about culture, to ask questions, all these questions that everything you wanted to ask but were afraid to before you kind of had this as a crutch, for lack of a better term, to lean on to say, hey, you said this in your survey, tell me more about that. So I really am leaning hard on this theory that I have, that part of the reason for the spectrum of interviews is because there's this kind of feeling in the back of the people's heads who are doing the hiring that, I just want to know more, but they don't know how to get more.
It's kind of amazing that when you think about this, is I even if I wouldn't agree with 100% of everything, this model is going to get bigger. I just see it happening just because it's going to make hiring more streamlined. And you're right. I think I read a thing a long time ago. 75% of the people that interview don't have any idea what they're talking about. It's like the guy that was late or forgot the donuts is the dude that has to do the interviews for the day. It's
Right.
like it's a punishment, in the company wide. But okay,
Yeah, it's not a reward.
no, it's not. You're like, oh God, I got to interview all day. I mean, and that's going to be a really great interview because he's going to hire the guy who likes, the dude that drinks or goes parties or plays golf or whatever. So you're going to get basically another clone of the guy that was late. So tell me, because since you've been in business, where's been the sweet spot? Like, what industry have you guys are kind of getting in where this is like, oh, hey, this is a real good vein that we're in? Where is that kind of layout right now?
So it's interesting I'll talk about the pre-employment side, and then I'll talk about the employee investigation side. With the pre-employment side, we actually started out really working heavily with state government, which that would include things like bureaus of investigation. It includes things like departments of corrections, departments of juvenile justice, those types of jobs. And so I'll speak to one on the pre-employment side that I find really interesting is corrections, because corrections is one of those positions that it's not glamorous. Like it's actually, there are a lot of incentives keeping people from actually wanting to work in corrections because it doesn't have that great of a reputation. What I've seen from our clients, what they've done is they've moved from this kind of like flailing, we need to hire anybody who can prop up a uniform, to we need to hire people who are going to reflect our culture and who are going to reduce the risk going forward. And those that take the long game, and it's a little bit painful because you are going to have unfilled spots for a while in an industry like that. Those that take that long game, after 2 or 3 years, they start to see crazy good results. So that's one that I feel is kind of interesting. But on the pre-employment side, I mean, we have banks we work with, we have manufacturing, we have government. I mean, it's behavioral interviewing is something that can be useful anywhere. And it's the way it's applied. So, you had referred to before about the types of workers who would just, tell you what they really thought of their boss versus the workers who would give you the kind of, politically correct answer. The that is going to be true no matter what kind of interviewing techniques you do or no matter what kind of tools you do. There's going to be different ways of answering those questions and different styles of answering those questions because everyone's unique. And so it's being able to kind of cut through the noise to understand the signal and get to what it is you want to get. I'll jump over now and talk about the employee investigation side of what we do, because this is I'd say newer, but we've been doing it now for about 4 years. So we realized after we'd been doing the pre-employment side of things for a while, what if we took this same concept and applied it inside an organization to uncover insider threats, to help with employee investigations, to answer questions about what your people know that nobody is asking them. And when we did that, we added another kind of bucket to what type of information we collect, and that is observations. The observations piece of what we do has become a crazy game changer because think about tip lines. So when you think about tip lines, think about the friction that keeps people from reporting. Like if you had a boss that was doing something that they shouldn't be doing, what would go through your head?
Oh, what should I do? I cover it up or do I just shut my pie hole?
Right.
Yeah,
Because you might be afraid of
yeah,
retaliation. You might be afraid of, getting beat up in the parking lot. I mean, it could be
yeah.
any manner of things. So what we have done is we have now put questions in our survey that ask you about those types of things. Do you know a colleague who's giving discounts against policy? Do you know a colleague or a manager who's made threats against someone here? So now you're in a very safe place. You're in a very safe place to just click yes. And the people who need to see that can see it right away. And we've actually added quite a few things to that. So we have, and this based on what our clients are kind of telling us. So, one of the things they told us was, hey, can you create a question that actually asks if they want to be contacted by the investigative team? And so we've added that to the survey. And so we have a question that's in there that, do you want to talk to somebody on the investigative team about what you've reported in this survey? And as soon as they click yes on that, the investigator gets a push notification that says this person wants to talk about their survey and a link to their survey. And what that does is it allows you to take what normally you would get from a tip line, which is very, very small, and expand it by orders of magnitude, like 100 times. And so that's kind of the cultural shift that our clients are seeing when they use this for internal employees, is that they are now understanding what's really going on in these stores. Because most of on that side of our business, it's almost all retail companies. And they're deploying these to stores to understand what's going on. And it's not just about, people admitting that they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. It's about understanding operational integrity issues now. Now we know that, 35% of the people here don't know what the discount policy is. Okay, now I need to do a training. We know that, 50% of the people here don't trust the manager. and we can see who those 50 people are. So if it's on a certain shift, whoa, okay, now we know we have a manager integrity issue. And the leadership piece of it is really huge, because if you have managers, or if you have leaders who are creating an integrity situation, or who are creating a trustworthiness situation, everybody who reports to them is either going to be disenfranchised or they're going to mirror the behavior. So the internal employee investigation side of what we do has turned into a lot more than just doing an investigation. There's the tactical, I have a store that's high shrink and I want to know what's going on. But there's also the strategic, I now know that I have people who are telling me that this store is not running like it's supposed to run. And I can see all that before I ever send somebody out to audit the store, before I do my first interview with anyone at the store. I know who I'm going to ask and what I'm going to ask them about.
That's
So
that's a
those
big.
are kind of the
I
two
think that's an
sides.
important part of your service, and we've run out of time. I mean, this has been a fascinating thing for me, and is what we'll do is we'll be sending you the links and things like that, and if you have any questions, let me know. But it was great having you, Russ. This was interesting enough for me to where I kind of get what's ever going on. And just want to say, all you people out there that have issues with tests, feel free to comment, because I know you will. This is Mike Hayes for the Hiring Confessional. Have a good day.